The cockpit smelled of oil and cold metal. A German pilot steadied his pencil against the vibrations of his Messerschmitt as he scrawled another tally mark in the margin of his logbook. Another heavy bomber destroyed. Another American giant falling in fire. He glanced through the canopy, watching the dark silhouette of a four-engine machine spiral toward the clouds below, its engines trailing a curtain of black smoke. To him, it looked like nothing more than another lumbering beast that had dared enter the Reich skies unprotected. Above him stretched a scene the Germans had grown used to, tightly packed American bombers fighting to keep formation, their turrets spitting bursts of tracer fire into empty sky. Yet the fighters knew the truth. The mathematics of this war favored them. They attacked from the sun, struck swiftly, and pulled away before a gunner could even adjust his sights. Each raid felt less like a duel and more like a harvest. The laughter among Luftwaffe pilots was not careless, it was confident. They believed they had solved the riddle of American bombing campaigns. Without long-range escorts, the flying fortresses were little more than targets painted against the daylight. On this day alone, hundreds of bombers had crossed into German airspace. By evening, dozens would never return, and many more would limp back with broken wings and shattered crews. The Americans called it courage. The Germans called it predictable slaughter. This was the paradox at the heart of the air war. German fighters had refined their tactics into something close to a science. Some struck head-on, aiming bursts directly into cockpits where the glass was weakest. Others attacked in broad lines, 8 or 10 fighters abreast, overwhelming the bombers' defensive fire with sheer speed and numbers. Each maneuver was practiced, calculated, devastating. To the young men in their cockpits, it seemed the skies of Germany would remain secure forever. But they had miscalculated one thing: the relentless American habit of solving problems that seemed impossible. At the heart of the American strategy was faith in formation. The combat box was designed as a fortress in the sky, a cluster of bombers whose overlapping fields of fire were meant to cover every angle. Each B-17 carried 13 heavy machine guns, a bristling forest of barrels pointing outward. On paper, no fighter could penetrate without being torn apart. In practice, blind spots and limited ammunition meant the bombers were far more vulnerable than planners had hoped. German flyers soon realized that numbers and nerve could smash through the box and send fortresses down in flames. The American escort fighters, bulky Thunderbolts and twin-engine Lightnings, were brave but short-legged. They could only follow the bombers so far before fuel forced them to turn back. German pilots called that moment the hour of gold. Radar tracked the bomber streams. Calculations told them exactly when the escorts would vanish. Then, like wolves scenting blood, the Luftwaffe fell upon the exposed formations. A bomber crew might face 4 hours over enemy territory, but less than half that with fighter protection. The Germans could attack, refuel, and attack again while the bombers still struggled homeward. It seemed an equation that guaranteed endless victory. And for months, German pilots believed the Americans would never solve it. But even as they laughed, something new was being prepared across the channel. The story of that transformation began not in Berlin or Washington, but in an office where British officials made a desperate request. They needed more fighters urgently. A company in California, better known for its trainers than for combat aircraft, proposed building an entirely new design in a matter of months. Engineers worked with sleepless intensity, producing a prototype that astonished test pilots with its sleek lines and smooth handling. Yet the first versions, powered by American engines, faltered at high altitude. They could dash low across fields and rivers, but at the very height where bombers flew, they gasped for breath. It was only when British mechanics suggested marrying the airframe with their own supercharged engines that the true potential emerged. With this new heart, the aircraft transformed. Suddenly it could climb above 20,000 feet with power to spare. Its ceiling leapt higher, its speed rivaled the best German interceptors and, most importantly, its fuel efficiency promised a range no other single-engine fighter had ever achieved. A solution had been born almost by accident, the child of Anglo-American collaboration. But when it appeared over Europe, it would change the very logic of the war. The Germans noticed the silhouette first. From a distance it resembled the Thunderbolt. Surely, they thought, these escorts would soon peel away, leaving the bombers to their fate as always. Yet the new fighters did not turn back. They pressed on, deeper into the Reich, beyond the limits anyone had believed possible. Confusion rippled through German command. Radio chatter betrayed disbelief. Confirmed type? How can they be here? The first encounters were brief, almost experimental. A handful of new fighters weaving among bombers, chasing away interceptors with aggressive dives. But soon the pattern grew. By the final weeks of winter, these machines were accompanying bombers all the way to central Germany. And then came the moment that silenced the laughter forever. The day American fighters appeared over the German capital itself. For years, Reich leaders had sworn no enemy would reach so far. The sanctity of the homeland had seemed unbreakable. Yet now, in the pale light above Berlin, bombers flew in vast formations, and circling them, protective as hawks, were the very fighters that should have turned back hundreds of miles before. For the German pilots who scrambled to intercept, it was as if the laws of physics had betrayed them. They had calculated every angle, every mile of range. None of it mattered now. What they faced was not simply a new aircraft, but a new reality. The air war had shifted overnight. And the hunters of yesterday were about to become the hunted. The first whispers spread through Luftwaffe squadrons like rumors of a ghost. Pilots returned from missions speaking of a new American fighter that chased them farther than expected. One that did not vanish when the escorts usually broke away. At first their comrades chuckled. Surely these were thunderbolts misidentified at distance, or nervous imaginations after hours of combat. But the sightings multiplied. Reports spoke of sleek shapes diving with predatory precision, pressing attacks even as German fighters tried to retreat to their airfields. Skepticism turned to unease when a Staffel commander returned pale, admitting he had been harried all the way to his landing approach. "They never left us," he muttered as if confessing to a crime. His men laughed to cover their fear, yet behind the laughter lay something new, doubt. What made this aircraft different was not only its speed or its guns, though both were formidable. It was the distance it could travel. A bomber crew knew that every gallon of fuel was life or death. American engineers had found ways to stretch endurance without sacrificing power. The new fighter carried tanks beneath its wings that fed into its fuselage like hidden reservoirs. Where others guzzled fuel, this one sipped it. At cruising speed, it consumed nearly half what a Thunderbolt required. The figures told the story. With smaller tanks, it could already escort bombers hundreds of miles deeper than before. With new external tanks, long, slender cylinders released once empty, its range extended to the heart of Germany. Suddenly, raids once thought suicidal were possible. Even Berlin lay within reach. The impact was not immediate but cumulative. Each raid in late winter brought more of these fighters. The bombers noticed it first. Crews who had braced for hours of isolation now saw silver shapes still circling them as they crossed the Rhine. For men inside freezing, vibrating fuselages, the sight was salvation. A waist gunner wrote later, "For the first time, I believed I might live to see England again." The Germans tried to adapt. They had once relied on timing, waiting beyond escort range, massing their squadrons where the Americans were naked. Now timing betrayed them. They rose to intercept, expecting the usual window of advantage, only to find themselves ambushed by escorts that should not have been there. The hunters became targets, their formations shredded by aggressive dives. Some Luftwaffe aces, veterans with dozens of kills, recognized the change immediately. One captain, after being driven from the sky by the new escorts, told his unit flatly, "Our sanctuary is gone." The words carried weight because until that moment, central Germany had been considered untouchable. Training schools, repair depots, even aircraft factories had been located there precisely because no enemy fighter could reach them. That illusion crumbled overnight. The psychological toll grew faster than the physical losses. Letters home, carefully censored yet still surviving in archives, reveal a shift in tone. Early in the war, German pilots wrote with swagger, boasting of turkey shoots against clumsy bombers. By spring of 1944, their language turned bleak. One young lieutenant admitted to his fiancée, "We no longer control when we fight. The enemy decides for us." The Americans, by contrast, felt a surge of confidence. For years, bomber crews had watched their comrades vanish in flames, powerless against concentrated attacks. Now they saw Mustangs diving through German formations, scattering interceptors before they could close in. Pilots who once viewed escort duty as tedious now relished the hunt. A squadron commander briefed his men with new orders. Protect the bombers, yes, but once the bombs fell, seek out the enemy. Destroy them wherever they rise. Attrition became strategy. The Americans understood that Germany could not replace its veteran pilots as quickly as it lost them. The new escorts ensured that every interception was costly for the Luftwaffe, not the bombers. Numbers confirmed the shift. In early 1944 alone, German air units lost thousands of trained men, while American pilot training programs produced more than 10,000 replacements per month. For the Luftwaffe, the arithmetic turned cruel. Fuel shortages already limited flight hours. Now every sortie meant facing opponents who outnumbered and outlasted them. A German ace might score victories, but each return to base showed fewer comrades waiting on the ground. And the replacements who climbed into cockpits beside him were boys, scarcely trained, barely steady at the controls, sent up against opponents with hundreds of combat hours. What had once been laughter around mess tables turned to silence. Even the boldest jokes, about burning fortresses or easy kills, rang hollow. Because everyone knew what waited beyond the horizon. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was, as one German officer admitted years later, a system, the weapon, the fuel, the industry, all in one machine. And that system was about to strike at the very core of German confidence. The belief that their homeland skies could never be truly conquered. The morning began like countless others. Sirens wailed across German airfields, mechanics rushed to clear chocks, and pilots clambered into cockpits that smelled of fuel and leather. Engines roared in unison, coughing smoke as squadrons prepared to climb. For the men strapping on their harnesses, the ritual had become second nature. Somewhere to the west, American bombers were crossing the front. They would rise, intercept, and harvest their kills. At altitude, the sun was a pale disk. Contrails marked the Americans' approach, long white scars stretching across the sky. A formation of flying fortresses, dozens wide and dozens deep, crawled toward its target. German pilots squinted at the scene, readying themselves for the familiar moment when escorts would peel away. The thunderbolts never lingered this far. They would turn back soon, leaving the bombers naked. But then came the first shock. The escorts did not turn. They pressed on. Sleek shapes, smaller and sharper than thunderbolts, hung close to the bombers like hawks guarding their brood. At first the Germans assumed it was a mistake. Some overconfident American squadron straying too far. They attacked anyway, diving head-on in practiced formation. The second shock came within seconds. Instead of breaking away, the new fighters met them mid-dive, cannon and machine guns blazing. German formations shattered under the onslaught. A pair of Messerschmitts spun downward, their wings sheared by streams of .50 caliber fire. The rest pulled hard, scattering in desperate spirals. What was supposed to be an attack became a rout. Those who survived carried the story back. The Americans had a fighter that would not leave them even above the heartland. The disbelief did not last long. Within weeks, every squadron had seen them. The Mustangs did not merely defend bombers. They hunted. Once the bombs fell, they broke formation, sweeping outward in aggressive packs. Airfields that had once seemed safe became death traps. Pilots returning low on fuel found themselves chased all the way to their runways, strafed as they attempted to land. For the first time, German flyers felt the war's brutality not only in the skies but at the very threshold of home. Statistics painted the truth with cruel clarity. In the winter of 1943, the Luftwaffe had destroyed hundreds of American bombers per month, often at a ratio that gave them confidence of eventual victory. By the spring of 1944, those ratios reversed. German units were losing more aircraft than they destroyed, and the balance grew worse with every raid. The shock deepened with each encounter. Luftwaffe tactics, once refined to perfection, began to crumble. Massed head-on assaults now ended in disaster as Mustangs tore through the attackers before they reached firing range. Attempts to strike from above were countered by escorts diving like predators from greater altitude. Even the famed Focke-Wulf 190s, once feared for their ruggedness, found themselves outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned. The irony was bitter. For years, German pilots had mocked the lumbering bombers as flying barns. They laughed at their supposed invulnerability, at the idea that overlapping fields of fire could save them. Yet now it was the fighters who felt penned in. Surrounded, pursued, stripped of the initiative, they became prey in the very skies they once ruled. Letters from the period capture the mood. One veteran ace confessed privately, "We rise with dread. The sky belongs to them now." Another, barely 20, wrote in despair that he no longer believed in victory but fought only for comrades who still live. Such words were unthinkable a year earlier, when victories had seemed endless. Meanwhile, the Americans sensed transformation. Bomber crews still suffered losses, engines still caught fire, men still bailed into frozen air, but the terror of helplessness began to lift. They spoke of Mustangs darting in and out of formation, chasing away attackers with aggressive dives. One gunner recalled in his diary, "It felt like angels had come with us." Strategically, the shift was enormous. With escorts reaching the capital, no German target was beyond reach. Synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, rail hubs, all became vulnerable. And the bombers that reached them did so with increasing survival rates. The Mustang was not just an aircraft, it was a key that unlocked the bombing campaign's full potential. For the Reich, this was the third shock, the realization that air superiority was slipping irretrievably away. Industrial production still churned, but each new machine was piloted by boys with fewer hours in the air. Training had collapsed under the pressure of fuel shortages and relentless raids. Veterans fell faster than they could be replaced. The once feared Luftwaffe was bleeding out. The laughter that had filled officers' messes gave way to silence. The flying barns still came, but now they came escorted, shielded, relentless. And the joke, once cruelly told at American expense, had turned against the very men who had laughed. The gray morning of March 1944 broke with a bitter chill. From the streets of Berlin, civilians craned their necks to the distant hum that grew louder by the minute. It was a sound they had come to know too well, the steady drone of engines, multiplied into a rolling thunder. For the first time, however, it was not a fleeting threat at the edges of the Reich. It was here above the capital itself. The bombers appeared as dark specks at first, then as immense formations. Row upon row of flying fortresses glinted in the pale light, their contrails weaving white scars across the sky. They had traveled hundreds of miles, beyond what German planners believed possible. Yet here they were, precise and unshaken, heading directly toward the heart of Berlin. German fighters scrambled in desperation. At airfields around the capital, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs clawed for altitude, engines screaming, pilots straining against G-forces as they rose to intercept. They had done this routine countless times before. Attack head-on, split the formation, break apart the bombers. That plan had always worked. But this time the bombers were not alone. Sleek shapes hovered beside them. Fighters that should not have been there, fighters that by all logic had no business over Berlin. Yet there they were, diving with lethal precision into German formations, scattering interceptors before they could even close on the bombers. One German pilot later recalled the moment bitterly, "We thought they would turn back. They did not. They followed us all the way even here." It was the unthinkable. The American P-51 Mustang had crossed into the very heart of the Reich and proved it could stay. The hour of gold, when escorts vanished, was gone. The sanctuary of central Germany had evaporated. The first clash over the capital was ferocious. German squadrons hurled themselves into the fight, but instead of isolated bombers, they found swarms of Mustangs diving upon them. Veteran aces tried to rally their men, yet even they were not immune. A celebrated commander with more than 50 victories was cut down in flames that day, his aircraft spiraling into the suburbs he had sworn to defend. For the Luftwaffe, it was more than the loss of a man. It was the loss of a symbol, proof that no skill could overcome what now faced them. Below, civilians huddled in cellars as bombs thundered down. Factories, rail junctions, and government ministries shook under waves of explosions. But above ground, the greater drama played out in the skies, where the balance of air power visibly shifted. For every German fighter that climbed, an American escort was there to meet it. For every pass toward the bombers, a Mustang slashed across the path, guns chattering. The invaders were no longer merely intruders. They were masters. Psychologically, the blow was catastrophic. For years, the regime had promised that Berlin was untouchable. Propaganda boasted that the capital was shielded by the finest fighter force in the world. Yet now citizens could watch with their own eyes as American aircraft swarmed the skies unchallenged. No amount of slogans could erase the reality overhead. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, reports poured in: staggering losses, broken formations, commanders missing. The numbers told a grim story. In just weeks, hundreds of fighters had been lost, and more importantly, irreplaceable veterans had been killed. German aircraft factories still churned out machines, but the pilots filling their cockpits were increasingly green boys with barely 40 hours of flight time. Against seasoned Mustang squadrons, they were lambs to the slaughter. The Americans, by contrast, grew bolder with each mission. Mustang pilots began ranging freely after the bombers had dropped their loads, attacking anything that moved: trains, convoys, even airfields themselves. German pilots returning home found runways raked with bullets, hangars burning, mechanics scattering. The very bases meant to project power had become killing grounds. For bomber crews, the transformation was palpable. Missions were still dangerous. Flak still tore through wings and engines, and gunners still watched comrades bail out into icy skies. But the sense of inevitability had shifted. Where once men prayed merely to survive, now they dared to believe in success. A navigator wrote in his journal, "Berlin itself lay beneath us, and still the Mustangs were there. For the first time I felt we could win this." For the Luftwaffe, it marked the beginning of collapse. They had once laughed at American bombers, calling them flying barns, and mocking their vulnerability. But on that March day the laughter died. Because the barns were no longer alone. They carried with them a new predator, one that had stripped German skies of their sanctuary. From that moment, the war in the air was no longer about defending Germany. It was about survival. And every pilot knew it. The shock of Mustangs over Berlin was not a passing event. It was the beginning of a relentless new reality. What had once been considered impossible was now routine. Day after day, waves of American bombers appeared above Germany, and always circling around them like wolves were the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt. New units were formed, tactics revised, heavier guns fitted to fighters. Some squadrons experimented with armored assault versions of the Focke-Wulf, designed to charge through defensive screens and blast bombers apart at close range. They were powerful on paper, bristling with cannons, but in practice they were sluggish targets. The nimble Mustangs cut them down before they ever reached the formations they were meant to destroy. Other German commanders tried mass attacks, sending entire groups into the sky at once in hopes of overwhelming the escorts. But the Americans too had learned. With longer range and better coordination, the Mustang groups divided their forces, intercepting attackers before they could concentrate. Again and again, German formations were broken apart, their scattered remnants picked off one by one. The statistics revealed the brutal arithmetic. In just 3 months of 1944, German fighter units reported thousands of losses, many of them seasoned veterans. Replacement pilots arrived in waves, but their training was dangerously abbreviated. Some had never even fired their weapons in the air before being thrown into combat. Against Mustang squadrons, flown by men with hundreds of hours in the cockpit, the outcome was never in doubt. A surviving German pilot later admitted, "We were no longer hunters. We were targets, flying machines we could barely control, facing enemies who seemed to know every move before we made it." Yet the battle was not only fought in the skies. It was waged in the fuel depots, the rail yards, and the synthetic oil plants that kept the Luftwaffe alive. With escort fighters now reaching deeper than ever, American planners shifted their focus. Bombs rained not just on factories but on the lifeblood of German aviation, fuel. The strikes were merciless. Refineries erupted in columns of fire. Storage tanks boiled over into rivers of black smoke. Synthetic plants, once thought safe in central Germany, lay in ruins under repeated raids. By summer, aviation fuel had dwindled to a fraction of what was needed. Squadrons once launching multiple missions a day were grounded for lack of petrol. Even the most advanced aircraft could not change this reality. Jet fighters, rockets, and late-war designs filled propaganda reels, but without fuel they remained museum pieces. Mechanics polished their canopies while Mustangs prowled above, waiting for any attempt to launch. The pressure on German pilots mounted unbearably. Missions grew shorter, hastier, and more desperate. Veteran survivors watched young replacements climb into cockpits with trembling hands. Some never returned from their first sortie. Others barely survived, crash-landing with empty tanks and bullet-riddled fuselages. One Luftwaffe officer described the feeling in a letter home. "Each time we take off, we know the Mustangs are waiting. They are everywhere, above us, behind us, circling even as we descend. There is no rest, no safe air. The sky belongs to them." For the Americans, the shift in momentum was tangible. Fighter groups reported unprecedented victory ratios. Some squadrons claimed 10 enemy aircraft destroyed for every one of their own lost. Pilots who once counted missions nervously now embraced the hunt. The orders were clear: protect the bombers but seek combat whenever possible. This new doctrine unleashed chaos upon the Luftwaffe. Mustang pilots dived onto airfields, strafed trains, shredded convoys. Anything that moved became a target. The intent was not merely to protect bombers, it was to annihilate German air power at its roots. The strategy worked with ruthless efficiency. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe morale had collapsed. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence painted a grim portrait. Pilots wrote of exhaustion, of hopelessness, of a certainty that their war was already lost. Even propaganda officers struggled to maintain the illusion of confidence. No one could ignore the silence of empty chairs in briefing rooms, the constant funerals, the endless black-edged notices sent to families. Meanwhile, in Allied bases across England, confidence grew. Mustang pilots spoke with awe of their aircraft's range and agility. A veteran described it simply: "We could go anywhere." The Reich was no longer vast. It was small, and every corner of it could be reached. The contrast could not have been sharper. Where once German pilots laughed at clumsy bombers, now they flew knowing that American fighters would chase them even to their runways. Where once the Reich boasted of invulnerability, now its skies were a battlefield the enemy dominated at will. The struggle dragged on into the hot months of summer, but the outcome was already decided. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. Its aircraft were still produced in impressive numbers, but its pilots were gone, its fuel was gone, and its hope was gone. The laughter of 1943 had turned to silence. In its place hung only the roar of Mustangs, circling high above, engines humming with inexhaustible power, heralds of a defeat that could no longer be denied. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in the skies. It could still boast thousands of aircraft on its inventory sheets, but many sat idle for lack of fuel, spare parts, or trained pilots. The war that had once seemed like a contest of equals had become something different. A systematic dismantling of Germany's ability to fight in the air. The contrast on D-Day revealed this in stark terms. As Allied armies stormed ashore in Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed only a few hundred sorties. Allied aircraft flew nearly 15,000. The sky above the invasion beaches belonged entirely to the Allies. German troops on the ground looked upward in desperation, waiting for their own air force, and found only enemy fighters circling in endless waves. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was absent from the decisive battle. Even the introduction of revolutionary technology could not alter the outcome. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, sleek and futuristic, was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang. In the hands of an expert, it could slice through bomber formations with terrifying efficiency. But these aircraft came too late and in too few numbers. Their engines demanded careful handling, their fuel consumption was enormous, and their bases were under constant attack. More jets were lost on takeoff and landing than in combat. Mustang pilots learned to circle airfields, waiting for jets to appear at their most vulnerable moment. German aces flew the jets with determination, some claiming dozens of victories even in the final months. Yet even they admitted it was hopeless. One veteran later reflected, "For every one of us there were 50 Mustangs. We had marvels of engineering, but they were only sparks in the storm." The attrition of pilots told the rest of the story. In 1943, a German pilot might enter combat with over 200 hours of training. By 1945, many had fewer than 50. They climbed into cockpits knowing they faced opponents with far more experience, in aircraft that outnumbered and outlasted them. Few survived their first encounters. The statistics were devastating. In the final year of the war, the Luftwaffe lost more than 12,000 pilots. Entire squadrons were wiped from the rolls. Even veteran commanders stopped pretending. Letters, memoirs, and post-war interviews all point to a single realization: the arrival of the Mustang had made their position impossible. One German general put it simply, "The bombers did not defeat us. The Mustang did." By 1945, American fighter groups dominated the skies with impunity. Mustangs escorted bombers to Berlin, to Munich, to the borders of Poland. They roamed across every corner of the Reich, strafing trains, blasting convoys, reducing the German war machine to rubble. What began as laughter in 1943 ended in silence, shattered only by the roar of Merlin engines above ruined cities. And when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow, its aircraft destroyed, its pilots dead or captured, its leaders acknowledging defeat not only on the battlefield but in the very domain where they had once reigned supreme, the sky. The story of the Mustang is more than just one of machines. It is a lesson about underestimating enemies, about the danger of arrogance, and about the power of innovation when combined with industrial might. The German pilots who once mocked American bombers discovered, too late, that their laughter was premature. They had not counted on a fighter that could follow the bombers anywhere, fight them on equal terms, and tip the balance of the entire war. That moment, when German pilots first looked up and saw Mustangs circling over Berlin, has been remembered by veterans as the day the Luftwaffe lost the war. It was not gradual. It was catastrophic. From predator to prey, from hunter to hunted, in less than 6 months. Few military forces in history have experienced such a complete reversal. Today, nearly 80 years later, the Mustang remains an icon. Its long wings, its growling engine note, its reputation as the fighter that won the air war, all endure in history and memory. Museums preserve it, airshows still fly it, and veterans speak of it with reverence. Not just as a machine but as a symbol of determination, cooperation, and the will to adapt faster than an enemy could resist. And perhaps that is why this story resonates even now. Because it is not only about technology or strategy. It is about the human spirit, about those who laughed too soon, and those who refused to give up until the skies were theirs. If you found this journey through history as fascinating as we have, let's continue keeping these stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think was the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the Luftwaffe? Was it the Mustang itself, or the larger machine of Allied industry behind it? We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel for more detailed explorations of the moments that shaped our world. Every interaction helps us bring you more stories like this one, keeping the memory of those who fought, and the lessons of their battles, alive for future generations. The skies of Europe in 1945 told a story written not in words, but in smoke and fire. A story where laughter became silence, and where a single aircraft helped change the destiny of nations. The Mustang silenced the laughter, and with it the Luftwaffe's dreams of supremacy.